Hello friends, welcome to our channel Study GS, and today we are going to continue our lecture on Indian polity, and this is part 3. In today's lesson we will learn about the historical background, and this we will read under two headings. First is the company rule and second is the crown rule. So it is important from two perspectives. It is part of modern history as well as it is part of polity. There are acts which are difficult to remember, so I will also tell you the tricks to remember all those features of those acts. Okay, so this all started in 1600 when British East India Company was established, and at that time the Mughal emperor was Jahangir. So the British East India Company used to fight many wars, for example in 1769 British fought with Hyder Ali, and in 1772 there was a great famine in Bengal. This all made British East India Company very poor. It defaulted in credit and it asked British government for a loan of approx 1 million pound. But in 1764 a great historic battle of the Battle of Buxar was fought, in which the British won, and this was under the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam's rule. Under this treaty, the Treaty of Allahabad, Diwani rights of Bihar, Orissa and Bengal came under the British East India Company, under which they got the right to collect revenue or taxes, and this made East India Company very rich. So this is Lord Warren Hastings, and his tenure is 1773 to 1785. The next acts which will come, like the Regulating Act of 1773, the Amending Act of 1781 and the Pitt's India Act of 1784, will come when he was the Governor of Bengal. So we will start with Regulating Act. Here, Regulating Act of 1773, here there are two sevens, so you can remember the mnemonic 7 and we will decode it. Here S stands for Supreme Court at Calcutta was established in 1774, where there was one Chief Justice, and the first Chief Justice was Elijah MP, and there were 3 brother judges. Next, E stands for East India Company was made answerable to Court of Directors. Here EIC is British East India Company and COD is Court of Directors, and it reported civil, revenue and military affairs. Next, V stands for Governor of Bengal became Governor General of Bengal. This is very important in the sense that Lord Warren Hastings was the last governor of Bengal and became the first Governor General of Bengal. Okay, so an executive council of 4 members was also created and which was working under him to assist him. Okay, the next E stands for East India Company was prohibited from private trade, accepting presents or bribe from the native rulers, and here N stands for no powers to governors of Bombay and Madras, and the governors of Bombay and Madras were made subordinate to Governor General of Bengal. And the next act is Amending Act of 1781. It is also called as the Act of Settlement. It was introduced just to rectify the defects of the Regulating Act, and only key provision is that it demarcated the relations between the Supreme Court and the Governor General in Council, the Executive Council of Governor General. Next act is the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Here you can remember the mnemonic Pitt, okay, because it was Pitt's India Act. So starting with P, here P stands for possessions. What is meant by possession? The company's territory in India was first time called as the British possessions in India, the British government's possessions in India. Next, increased control of British government over East India Company. It created court of directors. and Board of Control. So Board of Control was the representation of British government and Court of Directors was the representative of East India Company. So Court of Directors managed the commerce and the Board of Control managed civil, revenue and military affairs. So here double T stands for double government was created, the Board of Control and the Court of Directors. Next is Lord Minto. He is different from the Minto-Morley Reforms Act. Okay. So he is Lord Minto and his tenure was 1807 to 1813. The next act of Charter Act of 1813 is going to come when he was the Governor General of Bengal. So Charter Act of 1813, there are only two M's which you can remember very easily. First M stands for Monopoly of British East India Company was ended by the British government. Now other trading companies of the British can also come and trade in India. And the next M stands for missionaries were allowed to preach in India. Simple. Next is Lord William Bentinck. He was the Governor General of Bengal, the last Governor General of Bengal, and his tenure is 1828 to 1835. And the Charter Act of 1833 will come when Lord William Bentinck was the Governor General of Bengal. So here you can remember it by the mnemonic Gandhi. So here G stands for Governor General of Bengal became Governor General of India. So who was the last Governor General of Bengal? It was Lord William Bentinck. And who was the first Governor General of India? It was also Lord William Bentinck. Next, here A stands for East India Company now became purely an administrative body and all the commercial functions of the East India Company were stopped and it was no more a commercial body, it was purely an administrative body. And company's territory in India were held by in trust for His Majesty, his heirs and his successors. Next, N stands for no powers again to governors of Bombay and Madras and they were again made subordinate to the Governor General of India. Next, here D and H, they are together. It stands for Direct Exam for Higher Civil Services. At that time, there were two kinds of civil services. First, the convenanted civil services and second is unconvenanted civil services. Convenanted civil services were called as the higher civil services and unconvenanted civil services were called as the lower civil services. And this thing is very important that it was only an attempt to introduce a system of open competition for selection for Indians as well, but this provision was negated by the Court of Directors. Next, I stands for Introduction of Every Rule, Now an Act. Earlier all the previous acts were called as the regulations, while all the laws made under this act were to be called as acts. Next is Lord Dalhousie. So his tenure is 1848 to 1856. So when Charter Act of 1853 will come, he was the Governor General of India. So we will discuss Charter Act of 1853 and you can remember this by the mnemonic SLOT, where S stands for separation of executive and legislature. For the first time, this was a landmark act. Why? Because for the first time, legislation was treated as a special function of government. Earlier, Governor General and its council were responsible for both executive and legislature, but now it was treated as a separate function of the government. So additional 6 members were appointed under the Indian Legislative Council. ILC stands for Indian Legislative Council, and this acted as a mini parliament, same as the British Parliament. Next is L, local representation in Indian Legislative Council. So out of 6 members, 4 were from the provincial or local governments. Which were the 4 local governments? Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. Next is open competition system for selection and recruitment of civil servants. For the first time, the convenanted civil services or the higher civil services were thrown open to the Indians as well. And accordingly, Macaulay Committee was appointed in 1854. And last, T stands for termination of company rule at any time. Next is Lord Canning. His tenure is 1856 to 1858 and 1858 to 1862. Why I am writing his tenure in 2 brackets? Because we all know that in 1857 the Sepoy Mutiny broke out, or it is also called as the First War of Independence. So what happened is the British government got alarmed, okay, that all its territories will be gone if British East India Company will continue to rule. So all the territories, all the powers of government, all the revenues, etc. were transferred from British East India Company to the British Crown. Okay, so he was the first Viceroy of India. In Government of India Act of 1858, we will learn that he became the first Viceroy of India. A new office was created. Though you have to remember this thing, that the office of Governor General of India was not abolished at that time, but just an additional office of Viceroy was created. Okay, so we will learn about the Crown Rule, the Government of India Act of 1858 in the next part. Thank you.